The bad news is that we are all falling. The good news is that there is no ground. And I think in that moment, the vision for the flight school was born, both because I found myself in what felt like total and utter freefall. I was groundless and disoriented. But I was also able to see that is what it is to be human. Conditions are always changing. We're taught to try to control all the parts so that we would never be in free fall. But if we can accept that we are always falling and learn to navigate the elements using different ways of knowing, that's what I'm here to learn, and that's what I'm here to share and model. And that's what we're building at the flight school, is the world's school for learning to navigate the sky.
Welcome to System Catalyst, the show that cracks the code for making the world a better place. I'm your host, English Solve. Today, I'm speaking with entrepreneur and thought leader, Abby Falik. Abby is the co-founder and CEO of the Flight School, where she helps young leaders develop skills, confidence, and mindset to take bold action and make a positive impact. She also serves as a fellow at Stanford and an advisor at Harvard Business School. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, and PBS. She's been recognized as one of Fast Company's most creative people and Goldman Sachs' most intriguing entrepreneurs. Abby, what does that mean to be a most intriguing entrepreneur? Tell me a little bit about that title.
I guess from Goldman Sachs, I'll take it as high praise that I would intrigue them. I may not be the entrepreneur that they were going to, bet all their financial returns on, but I am someone who is disruptive, dot connecting, and kind of an unlikely trajectory to get me to the work that I'm doing.
I love that. I hope that's like your LinkedIn. Like that, just right there. That's perfect. That would intrigue me.
Maybe it is. Maybe it will be now. Yeah.
I love it.
I think to be called intriguing by Goldman Sachs, that feels like just the right label.
I agree. I love it. So, Abby, I'm so excited to get into this conversation with you today. I really just kind of want to start off, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about how your journey into entrepreneurship, into social entrepreneurship, and really sort of this world of systems change that you find yourself in. How did this start? What was the moment that you visualized in your mind where you're sort of like, okay, that was kind of my starting point?
I can't say there was a moment. I think I once heard entrepreneurship described as a slow cook rather than a eureka moment. So seeds that dropped over the course of a lifetime. And I can't not start by acknowledging the family context I was born into. I had parents who modeled generosity and giving back just as a core part of who they were and what they were teaching us. It meant to be a good citizen and human in the world. They also made very deliberate decisions to expose us as young kids to dramatically different ways of living. So we spent time in Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, Latin America, in our very formative years. And we weren't just doing standard tourist things necessarily. We would visit schools and had experiences that made such an imprint on me of seeing the water I happened to have been born into from a distance, that I could see the gifts and opportunities that I had been afforded just by random dint of the birth lottery. And it awakened something in me, a sense of commonality with humans anywhere, a sense that I had hopes and dreams that were likely shared by any kid my age, regardless of where they happened to have been born, and an awareness of my own privilege and opportunity, and a clear sense that I was here on Earth to do something to pay it forward and to create opportunities for others with the opportunity that I'd been given. Michael Brown, the founder of City Year, has been a mentor to me, and I remember he once described it as a social justice nerve that once it's exposed, you can't ignore it. And so that nerve was exposed so early for me that it became a very continual thread that has informed every decision I've made.
Wow. What an amazing kind of metaphor and process of like, okay, this exposing this social justice nerve or exposing this rawness and this passion to move in the world and make change in the world. How do you relate that metaphor to kind of the impetus of starting Global Citizen Year and, in a sense, exposing that nerve into the students and the folks that you've been able to just have throughout that program?
The through line is so clear to me that the formative experiences I had that all happened far from a traditional classroom or school were actually the most informative in me beginning to define who I was and what I was here for. So I moved through high school as what we would now call an excellent sheep. I was good at playing the school game. I understood what was expected of me, and I checked the boxes and got the scores and got into Stanford, which had been presented as the golden ring, the goal to be hustling toward. And I remember vividly winning what I'd worked toward and feeling a sense of hollowness in the achievement and feeling confused about, I couldn't have named it at the time, but there was a sense of whose race am I running? Was this my goal or was it society's expectation? And why in the world is everybody around me encouraging me to keep sprinting with my head down rather than to pause, look up, and take some time at this really formative juncture in my life to figure out who I am and what I'm here for? Because of the early travel experience, I had a sense that the things I was most drawn to learn were not the things that were being taught in a high school classroom and were unlikely to appear in the lecture hall in college. And I desperately wanted to take some space between one stage of schooling and the next. And I remember calling the Peace Corps, and they said, you need a college degree, and thinking it was ironic that 18-year-olds around the world are invited into military service or religious service or in indigenous communities, various forms of rites of passage that take advantage of that formative developmental moment between dependence and independence, childhood and adulthood. And yet we fly by that opening in Western modern culture under some false notion that there's a race to complete and that the faster you get there and the less you veer from the course, the more successful you are. And so that was one of the seeds planted for me, was as I was 18 standing at that cusp, I recognized that what I wanted most was really at odds with what the systems and structures around me were set up to encourage. And for a whole confluence of reasons that already felt very dissonant to me, this sense that we had described and defined success in such narrow terms, and that I had access and exposure enough to recognize that the people we were calling, quote, successful were not necessarily the most happy, fulfilled, aligned, impactful, whole. And so that was one of the seeds for me as well, was recognizing that we'd created this whole conveyor belt of steps to get somebody into a, quote, successful landing point in society without even questioning, is that somewhere worth aiming for? And is that somewhere I want to land?
So in hearing this and understanding kind of where this foundation started for you, is that sort of the through line to the founding of Global Citizen Year and kind of the system that Global Citizen Year aimed to alter or to change? And tell me a little bit about kind of how that system has looked and the system that Global Citizen Year aimed to create.
So I launched Global Citizen Year coming out of Harvard Business School, which was the last place on the planet I thought I would land. I had never met anybody who'd been to business school. I had no interest in business per se, but I did have an intuitive sense that this was a place to learn about power and about leadership. And I look back on the experience at HBS as my own rite of passage. I'd been living and working in New York for about 5 years prior to that and dabbling in different spiritual communities and really just in a process that I wished had happened sooner. I think it would have benefited me enormously to have some contemplative tools and practices as I moved through high school and college and into my 20s. But what I remember getting to HBS and feeling like my one commitment was to not lose myself while I was there. And in many ways, it became an experience that fortified my sense of myself. So I didn't really feel tempted to go into banking or consulting like all of my peers because I had just come at it from a different angle. And I was there with a different lens for how to use the experience. And I remember between the 2 years, everybody goes out for the summer to get an internship. And I had followed a social entrepreneur out of his talk and asked if I could create a job for myself for the summer. And I was helping them think about how to expand their school and library template across Latin America. It was a beautiful and perfect opportunity for me to be learning from somebody I admired for the summer. And we came back to school in the fall, and I remember classmates saying, my gosh, that's so cool. But that job wasn't in the job bank. And something clicked for me that somehow we had all arrived on this campus, excellent sheep to the extreme, and forgotten our own agency, forgotten that there might be jobs worth taking that were not in the job bank. And it reinforced for me the sense that shaping our values and identity and conviction, one, happens outside of the classroom context. Two, the sooner it happens, the sooner it begins informing every decision we make. And three, it's like this robust fortification against the herd mentality. It allows us to reorient from what I've started calling fear-based achievement to a much more authentic way of aligning what I do with what I'm here for. And I was so disillusioned at the end of my time in business school to feel like there was so much talent and possibility, and so much of it was being funneled into the least risky and most apparently lucrative roles. And now, 15 years out, so many of my classmates hit a point where they realize they've achieved everything they sought out to achieve, but they're looking for something more, and they're questioning some of the choices that they made. And so I've been on a mission ever since that point after high school, when I was already beginning to see the game from a distance, on a mission to disrupt this cycle, to create openings so that more of us sooner have the opportunity to take time to figure out who we are, what the world needs from us, and what our role can be before we get even further down the conveyor belt.
I feel that a lot of what you're describing, like in itself, so this podcast, right, what we aim to do is sort of highlight the systems and the catalysts who are working to move or change or disrupt those systems in order, in some ways to repair systems or create new systems. the system that you're talking about is really one of this inner self work in order to, and I think you and I were in this same session at school, so I'm going to use this word, but it's this systeming that we do, right? And the inner work it takes to be a systems entrepreneur or systems catalyst with understanding that parts of ourselves, parts of our humanness bleed into how we system in the world. And so the system I hear you describing has such intense overlap with the world of systems change in general. And you've often talked about how entrepreneurship and systems change is so much on inner work, so much on self-work. So tell me a little bit about that overlap and where that hits for you in your journey.
Well, I'm very aware that systems are composed of people. They don't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And it may have been that same session at Skoll English, but the thing that I took from the Skoll Forum this year was a monk from Plum Village leading a conversation about climate grief, and describing that we've spent decades trying to solve things at the level of the story, the program, the policy. And yet we can't actually solve anything until we have changed the most significant input, which is our intention, our attitude, our orientation. And the phrase he shared that I think about now every day is that the how is the what. How we show up determines everything about the exchange and the outcome. And so I start to see the world as an aggregation of the how, which leads me to a theory of change that says until we can transform the inner experience, nothing on the outside is going to change in the ways that we need.
I remember this session at school. I remember exactly what you're talking about. And that felt it. I remember being there and it feeling very like, almost like an aha, but also like an of course.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know from you, in taking that frame of the how being the what, what is it that you have had to let go of or unlearn in trying to embody that in your current work?
Well, as we've now heard from the intro through the sort of various insights I gathered along this entrepreneurial journey and the contexts where I found myself, I am the epitome of the conditioning that our society has developed for us. I've had all of these hooks in me, the striving, the achieving, the looking to external validation to prove my worth. All of these forces conspire to lead us further from our own inner knowing. And so I would say that I have spent decades of my life quite focused on the what. The title, how much money we'd raised, who the partners were, the press we might have earned. And in this transition between Global Citizen Year and what's coming next with the flight school, I took my own advice and around the power of the pause and the importance of creating space between one experience and what comes next in order to revisit a set of questions about who am I now? How has the world changed since I was building Global Citizen Year? And what's my role now at the intersection of these two things? And it was a humbling, a remembering, and a recognition of a set of inner resources that I carried with me that were so independent of any of the outer conditions or outer acknowledgement. The ending at Global Citizen Year was very painful. I had built and led the organization and team for a dozen years. In 2020, we were welcoming our 1,000th fellow home from their placements. The model was to place 18-year-olds, primarily from the U.S., in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to spend 8 months, the equivalent of a school year, living with a family and working as an apprentice on a local project. And the idea was an echo of the experience that I had had at the front end of college that had shaped my values and identity in a way that I could never unsee or undo. But what would it look like to gather really ambitious young people and give them the kinds of formative, humbling experiences that shaped them sooner? So this was the model. We were welcoming our 1,000th fellow home in March of 2020, and it became an emergency evacuation because of COVID. And immediately it was clear that the what of what we'd been doing, sending kids on airplanes to live in communities around the world, was no longer possible. And it allowed me to step into a very generative entrepreneurial space again that said, well, what of the impact of this model, of the transformative experience, could be delivered in a different form? And I had seen over and over how deeply impactful it had been for young people, particularly those who'd been hyper-conditioned as excellent sheep, to have experiences that allowed them to be a beginner, to fail, to build empathy and compassion by staying somewhere long enough to sink beneath their initial preconceptions and judgments, to take on new worldviews. Like, as soon as we know there's more than one way to see the world, to name the world, we know there could be infinite. This to me felt like the essence of what's needed. And so when COVID hit, I had this intuition that there was an opening of opportunity to take the components apart. What if we unhooked the inner awakening from the outer complexity of this global travel program? And how could we anchor on the inner development? And so we spent some time playing with that at Global Citizen Year. I raised a big chunk of money, philanthropy, to reimagine the organization in a new form that to me felt like it matched the moment and the imperative around not just scaling ourselves, but scaling the impact. And things with all that money in the bank came to a head between me and the board, and I was ready to disrupt ourselves. The board was hungry to get back to, quote, normal and, quote, stability. And they gave my COO my job, asked me to figure out a new role for myself, supporting her. And the way it was handled and communicated and executed left me feeling deeply disrespected, wildly misunderstood, and hurt by people I had deeply trusted. And I recognized that energetically I had outgrown what I had built, and they had set me free, and it was my opportunity to build again. But it was a trauma beyond anything I'd experienced. But I can see now, 3 years out, that it was the greatest gift imaginable.
I mean, Abby, I feel like your story is probably one that is also just echoed, in over the coffee tables and over the, text threads of so many entrepreneurs, so many system catalysts. And what is this, there is a great irony in building something to change a system that ultimately turns into its own system, that becomes almost not able to permeate, to change at all, right? You've built this thing, and on the one hand, you've built this incredibly resilient thing, and on the other hand, you're like, but how then do we adapt for continuing the path of changing the system we set out to change? Mm-hmm. It feels like, a quintessential catch-22 of systems entrepreneurship and systems catalyst. I'm curious to know how, I think number one, you have been able to take this moment of transition, right? Like, and really use it and really lean into it, the good, the bad, the difficult, and now sort of be on this other side of the flight school. And what does that represent to you in your journey of systems change?
Just want to reflect on a couple things you just said about the irony of building organizations that are not adaptable or emergent to changing conditions. And it leads me back to the unit of change needing to be the individual.
Mm.
That an organization or an organism, which is how we see ourselves at the flight school, is a collection of humans.
Mm-hmm.
And our resilience and ability to adapt and let go and experiment is only as robust as our ability individually to sit with discomfort, to notice when fear is driving, to find ease in ambiguity and change. So my experience at Global Citizen here that I see reflected across the sector is that we build things and we begin to confuse the purpose, where the mission often becomes, how long can we sustain this thing? Not what is the most impactful way to drive the mission forward. And the money I had raised at Global Citizen Year was interpreted by a board as a lifeline to sustainability. They were asking, how long can this money last us? I was asking, how do we use this money to catalyze systemic change? And I can see clearly that my approach was disruptive and unsettling. I can see where the break began and how it ended, and that it makes sense. But it also emboldened me now to build completely differently. This notion of perpetuity and we need to be around forever, and even questions about, sustainability, to me, should not take precedence to how do we drive change today? How do we catalyze impact in a way that's specific to what's needed and what we're here to do? My co-founder, Shalon, at the flight school, she and I have a notion that the flight school is as much a project and moment in time, catalyst, beacon, lighthouse, as it is an organization that needs to be sustained. So we're holding it lightly as it emerges, but we are more focused on how we drive impact now as the world changes than on how do we create something that lasts forever.
It is really interesting to unpack this notion of what it takes to change and evolve something versus what it takes to build something that is forever resilient and lasts into even a future in which maybe that thing is less relevant. And I'm very curious to know what you might say to other system catalysts who either haven't hit a point like you did with Global Citizen transpiring kind of the way that it did and moving on to something else, in the vein of trying to continue to move the system that you always set out to move, or are experiencing that exact thing right now? What now, having that kind of in your rearview mirror and able to harness that into the future, what would you say to these system catalysts?
I am learning that if something feels too small energetically, that it is. I am learning to trust my knowing. I think for any of the system catalysts you're talking to and the social entrepreneurs who are taking leaps of faith to conjure things out of the ether, that we can trust ourselves and our knowing. And all of the experiences that have come together to give us a heightened sensitivity to what's possible and what's needed. And if we were to just respond to external conditions of, well, nobody's funding this work. Well, colleges aren't adapting their policies quickly enough. We would all stop before we began or stop short of what's needed. I've started thinking about entrepreneurship in a frame of, and it came from a coach we work with, his name is Tom Nixon, but he talks about working with source. And that entrepreneurial leadership is not so much about building as it is sourcing, which to me becomes a really high spiritual calling around opening a clearer channel between me and what can move through me into the world. But it allows me to engage all of my senses, not just my intellect that says I can run the numbers and show the business school types a business plan that compels them. I've come to see a lot of that behavior as what I'm now calling false certainty. That we are so drawn to the discussion about the numbers in the spreadsheet, about the growth diagram, the outcome metrics. And I'm not going to diminish that those things are important guideposts, but I'm also convinced there are more important guides in the work when it is work that is outside of the existing systems, outside of the market and the market-based solutions, and where the impact is immeasurable.
I think that resonates a lot. And I think I hear a lot of that across the board, especially when we're talking about the patience and the open-mindedness it takes to really move systems. It's not something that you witness overnight. It's not a direct causation effect. It is a series of interrelated, interconnected moments that eventually result in you being able to see relative to what was, what is. And I'm curious to know how you take that learning now into the flight school. And what does that look like day to day for you, especially when you probably have to combat or deal with the fact that there's always going to be people out there saying, well, what are the numbers? What are the fundraising goals? What are the impact goals? How do you thread the needle in that conversation with what the things that you just said? What else?
Well, I can rattle off the numbers and rattle off the funding needs. But what I'm more interested in is nudging us all toward the more important conversations about what impact looks and feels like when it's not confined to a number. In the work I've been involved in an ongoing way, which is very much about human development, it's so ironic to me that the funding community will fixate on data points that are such thin representations of what it actually means to develop a human. And all I have to do is remind somebody sitting across from me that they couldn't possibly measure the success of their kids' school by one measure. I mean, they'd say it's a test score or a college they got into. But any of us with kids recognize that those are very insufficient metrics. And yet somehow in social change work, we're looking for the certainty that we can measure it and track it and know it in a certain way of knowing. I had a very full circle experience a couple weeks ago. One of our inaugural flight school students is starting as a freshman at Stanford. So to be back on campus decades later and to sit across from Liam, who had not gone straight from high school without pause. He'd spent a year with us at the flight school. We were sitting at coffee. He was just arriving and starting to orient, and he said, "Abby, my goal while I'm here is to not lose myself."
Wow. Wow.
And I was so moved. Now, there's no number that could have said we were successful or not with this first cohort. But for me, that was the moment of knowing, of deepening my conviction that this is the work I'm here to do. And that this impact is immeasurable, not in a way that we should diminish. I recently met some Bhutanese entrepreneurs. They're building a K-12 and a higher ed in Bhutan. And they said with this sparkle in their eye that they are building schools around the immeasurable qualities.
Wow.
And to say that as a point of pride, as opposed to something that you're hiding from the donor, to me unlocks everything that we care more about. Generosity, compassion, courage, intuition cannot be measured. And yes, we're gathering data, but the data that matters more to me is the evidence that when we open someone's heart, when we help them get quiet enough to sit with discomfort and fear, to alchemize it into courage, to know that they even have a self to lose. That to me is the awakening. And we're designing the flight school to be the world's platform that provides that kind of awakening to young people all over the planet.
Ooh. Abby, I know that I could probably sit here and ask you so many questions all day long. And I just love the visuals that you're giving us with this beautiful work that you're doing. I'm wondering, as we wrap, is there one question or just sort of thought-provoking narrative or visual that you want to leave with our listeners? A lot of times in this podcast, we like to end kind of with a query, something that people can be thinking about over the dinner table tonight.
I've got two.
Amazing.
And they're related. The first was shared with me by a friend and teacher who had trained as a Zen monk. And it was right after things had broken apart at Global Citizeneer. And he shared a Zen koan that says, "The bad news is that we are all falling. The good news is that there is no ground." And I think in that moment, the vision for the flight school was born, both because I found myself in what felt like total and utter free fall. I was groundless and disoriented. But I was also able to see that is what it is to be human. Conditions are always changing. We're taught to try to control all the parts so that we would never be in free fall. But if we can accept that we are always falling and learn to navigate the elements using different ways of knowing, that's what I'm here to learn, and that's what I'm here to share and model. And that's what we're building at the flight school, is the world's school for learning to navigate the sky.
Wow.
The other was shared again recently at this retreat by a wise elder who said, we're always making a choice between love and fear, love and fear. And if we don't know what's guiding the choice, it can't be love.
Mm.
So the provocation to us is, will we choose fear or will we choose love?
Mm. Wow. Abby, thank you so much. I feel so nourished by this conversation. It was like talking with you is like drinking hot tea. It just is. I'm so hopeful and I'm so excited. I have 4 kids, 6, 7, 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, 10. She just had a birthday. And the thought that what you're building can exist for them really just sends me beaming. Like, I'm so excited that could be a world that they live in. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for coming on this podcast and telling us about it and leaving us with so much of this, just these amazing, yummy visuals that you have and this advice, and being so raw and sharing with us. So thank you, Abby.
Thank you, English, for seeing me, holding me, welcoming me, all of me in, and creating a space where these really important conversations get revealed.
Thank you.